Hey everybody, Dom here from Lensprotogo and Lens Rentals, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing a few camera tests in the studio, and the camera that we're testing today is the Panasonic LUMIX S1H. We're going to be testing out the ISO performance of this camera as well as the exposure recovery when over and underexposed. This video will also complete the trio of ISO tests for all of the current LUMIX S1 cameras, as Greg already did these tests for the S1 and the S1R last year, which I'll link to in the description. Now, the difference that we get with a more video-focused Panasonic S1H compared to the S1 and the S1R are the dual native ISO ranges. Where the S1 and the S1R had a native ISO of 400, in the S1H we have a low base of 640 and a high base of 4000. So in this first test, I'm going to go all the way up the scale of ISO values in this camera, spanning across both the low and the high ISO ranges. This first part of the test was recorded in 4K UHD in Panasonic Vlog, which was then converted to a Rec 709 color space. I used the 10-bit 422 All-I H.264 codec, using the full sensor readout with noise reduction set to 0. Also, the lens I used for this test is the Sigma Art 85mm f1.4 for L-mount. So with all that out of the way, let's take a look at this first test. So, starting in the low ISO range, we're looking at our low base of 640, which as expected is completely perfect with no gain noticeable until you're way zoomed in. And it's a similar story with the next few stops. At 800 ISO, we have no visible noise whatsoever when you're looking at the image as a whole. 1600, same story. Even in the dark shadows, there's really no visible noise unless you're really looking for it. Now at 3200, we are starting to introduce some barely visible noise, and it's only truly noticeable in the shadows. But the overall image is still generally unaffected. Okay, now we're at the equivalent of the high base ISO of 4000, but in the low range. So comparatively, it's a lot more amplified than the base 4000. The noise is a hair larger than before, and the tiniest bit of green chroma noise is now coming through. But even still, this image is basically at perfect fidelity. The colors are unaffected, and we still have an excellent dynamic range. Okay, now I'm going to go one notch past 4000 to 5000, which is the maximum for the low ISO range. So technically, there's a bit of overlap in this test. Here, we still have an excellent image, just getting a bit noisier in the shadows, and the image as a whole has the tiniest bit of green tint to it now, but otherwise, I'm really impressed with the entire low range. Now we're in the high ISO range, and we're jumping back down to 4000. But this time, it's the 4000 in the high range, which is the camera's higher base ISO. So theoretically, the signal shouldn't be any more amplified than the image was at 640 in the low range. And that's due to a circuitry change in the sensor that Panasonic made for the S1H. So to my eye, that is mostly true, but 4000 does have a bit more noticeable gain than its 640 counterpart, and again, introduces a slight shade of green chroma noise across the image. Though I should say that I'm really splitting hairs here, and we're talking about a pretty negligible difference. For the most part, the 4000 base is really clean. You've still got really good color rendition and a solid amount of room to work with in post. At 6400, we still have an acceptable image. We are starting to introduce the very beginning of some of the problem areas mentioned before, which are the green shift and the increased noise in the shadows, which from this point on are going to get gradually worse. But currently, at 6400, those are still pretty minimal. Okay, 12800. That green shift is a bit more noticeable now, and the noise in the shadows is starting to get a bit larger and dancier. But it's still really confined to those shadow areas, and the mids and highlights are still generally unaffected. I would definitely use 12800 if I was in a pinch. Alrighty, at 55,600, we're definitely starting to see that green shift getting much more prominent, and the noise is starting to get pretty bad in the shadows and is even creeping into some of the lower midtones. Finally, at 51,200 ISO, we're starting to see some very noticeable grain and a large presence of all sorts of chroma noise, but especially green. But with this being said, there are still some areas of the image that remain mostly unaffected, mainly the highlights. Okay, so that pretty much wraps it up for the ISO performance test, and my main takeaway from that is that I'm pretty impressed with the LUMIX S1H. And I'm not that surprised, because the original S1 and S1R were also really impressive ISO-wise. So the entire low ISO range of this camera had basically no visible noise at all, and that's a great thing. And once you get up into the higher regions, you are going to start to see some of that noise, but I think the S1H does a really good job of confining that mostly to the shadow areas. Also, once you get into that higher range, you are going to start to see color fidelity suffer a little bit, but that's really only once you get to those really high levels. Now it's time to transition to the second part of our test, exposure recovery. So I'm going to do this test in both of the camera's base ISOs, 640 and 4000, in the same settings that I did the previous test in. And then I'm going to do the same exposure recovery test in the ProRes RAW codec. So let's dive into the second part of the test, exposure recovery. Alright, so here is the correctly exposed image at ISO 640, which will remain in the middle, and on your left you're going to see the overexposed image, and on the right you'll see what I was able to recover from that in post. And at one stop over, we have basically no loss at all. Okay, 2 stops over, we're still looking really good. Nothing to report. Alright, 3 stops over, we're still looking great. The only thing missing are some real subtle values on my face. But other than that, we're pretty much all the way back to normal. Alright, at 4 stops, we're starting to get a bit lossy, with some of those highlight values getting a little crunched like in the mug above me. But otherwise, looks pretty great if you consider the original image on the left. Okay, finally at 5 stops, we have some irrecoverable information on my face, but again, if you consider the original image, this is pretty impressive. So overexposure in Vlog performed pretty well, which is expected because log video handles overexposure much better than underexposure. So with that being said, let's check out how it performs when underexposed in Vlog. Alright, 1 stop underexposed is looking great. Once we get to 2 stops under, now we're starting to see the very start of some information loss in the shadow areas, but it's not affecting skin tones too much. Now at 3 stops under, most of our shadow values are getting a little bit hazy, and now that loss is starting to get much more noticeable, especially in dark areas like my hair. Alright, at 4 stops, my scopes are starting to get a little bit ambiguous, and we're really fighting for information here. Bringing up this image back to normal brings up a lot of noise and a large green shift, which I had to counter pretty harshly. And finally, at 5 stops underexposed, we have all of the previously mentioned problems just amplified. The image is completely taken over by grain, and massive chunks and blocks of this image are flickering, but it was basically pitch black, so that's kind of cool. Alright, jumping right into the same test, but in the higher base ISO of 4000. So 1 stop overexposed, we're looking pretty great with no visible loss. Same story with 2 stops over, looking totally fine. Now again, at 3 stops, we're starting to see a little bit of loss in the highlights again, and at this point, I'm boosting up the contrast quite a bit in order to get close to my original range. Okay, 4 stops over is looking pretty darn good considering the original image on the left. Again, you get some loss in that mug, but most of my values are very similar. But now my contrast slider is completely maxed out. And finally, at 5 stops over, we again have irrecoverable information in my face as well as the chart in the mug behind me. But again, pretty good considering how ghostly I'm looking in the original. Okay, moving to underexposure in 4000, and just a reminder, you're going to see the original on the left, the correct exposure in the middle, and the recovered image on the right. At 1 stop under, we're looking great with no loss. 2 stops under is looking great as well. The only thing that's going to start to happen here is a gradual shift towards a warmer color temp, which was pretty easy to correct for. Now at 3 stops under, the difference in the shadow values are getting pretty noticeable, and bringing them up that much is starting to introduce some grain and a pretty hefty green cast across the image. At 4 stops underexposed, this image is starting to get really hard to work with, and grain is starting to take over the whole image. Which is a similar story at 5 stops under as well, where pretty much none of the original values are in true fidelity. Okay, that wraps up the exposure recovery test from the Vlog video in both base ISOs from the Panasonic S1H. But now I want to move on to the second part of the exposure recovery test, raw exposure recovery. So these tests were taken in the 5.9K ProRes RAW codec available through external recording on the S1H. And here is the image at correct exposure. So I'm going to brush through these next few pretty quickly because hint hint, the raw codec handled this test really well. So even at 2 stops overexposed, we have a perfectly recovered image with no information loss whatsoever, and this is also true of 3 stops overexposed. At 4 stops, we're still looking really good here, with the only lost information in the very upper highlights. Finally, at 5 stops over, we see a pretty drastic fall off in fidelity, with some massive information lost in my skin tones, but again, when you look at the original image, it's no surprise. Alright, finally moving on to underexposure recovery in RAW. And starting at 1 stop, no surprise, we're looking pretty great. 2 stops under, we're still looking good, just the information in the shadow area is a bit obfuscated. There's a nice $2 word for you. And we're starting to introduce some noise. At 3 stops under, now all of the values are getting a little bit more blurry in my scopes, and the grain is increasing. Skin tones are looking not too terrible, depending on who you ask, but certainly getting a bit lossy. Now at 4 stops, we have some serious noise corrupting the image, which is also bringing out that green shift that's been a theme in these underexposure tests. Finally, at 5 stops under, our recovered image is completely taken over by large and uncontrollable grain, and again, with massive amounts of green chroma noise. Okay, so that wraps up the ISO performance and exposure recovery test of the Panasonic LUMIX S1H. And my main takeaway from that is that the S1H is a seriously versatile camera for a lot of reasons. But in this instance specifically, I mean that the video from the S1H has a really good amount of work with in your editing program. And if you shoot in RAW, it's almost like you can't do wrong. So if you want to try out the LUMIX S1H for yourself, you can rent it from the Lensprotogo or Lens Rentals websites. And if you have a question about the S1H or any of the tests that I did today, drop a comment in the comment section. And if you found this video helpful, make sure you hit that like button. And if you're not already, subscribe to the channel so you can stay tuned in for more of our weekly content. And we'll see you in the next one.